Amundsen here to present the seminar. He got his bachelor's degree in meteorology, atmospheric sciences from FSU in 2023, and then he came here as a graduate student. He's about to finish his master's degree. He's going to be talking about Arctic clouds and cold air outbreaks today.
Thank you for the introduction, Greg. With that, I guess I'll go ahead and get started. There's a lot of stuff I have to talk about. But yes, as Greg mentioned, I'll be talking about some preliminary results that I have for my master's research that I hope to be finishing up in the near future. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. And so we'll go ahead and introduce and motivate our field campaign and all the research that I've been doing thus far. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Arctic amplification, where the Arctic is warming faster than anywhere else currently on Earth. Boundary layer convective clouds over open water are common off of boreal continents and the Antarctic ice sheet. And these clouds are poorly documented and are in a dynamic gray zone for weather and climate models, where marine boundary layer processes and convection are tightly coupled and cannot be parameterized individually. Boundary layer convection during cold air outbreak events is poorly understood, and such events bring significant weather hazards and profoundly impact global atmospheric and oceanic circulations. Some of these significant weather hazards that are often experienced with these Arctic cold air outbreaks are extremely low temperatures, gale force low-level winds, and heavy snowfall as well. Even though there have been prior studies and field campaigns using in-situ measurements and retrievals, convective marine boundary layer clouds occurring during these Arctic cold air outbreaks have not thoroughly been documented due to such few observations that we have overall. So the field campaign CEASAR was then born. However, before I go into the field campaign itself, I want to also introduce cold air outbreaks for those of you that may be unfamiliar with what they are. Cold air outbreaks are the advection of cold, dry air masses from the central Arctic or cold continents onto the open sea. They're typically characterized by strong vertical temperature gradients in the lower troposphere. And marine cold air outbreaks are accompanied by large air-sea heat exchanges as they flow out over the warmer waters extending from the Greenland ice sheet. Some of the surface heat fluxes in this region during these cold air outbreaks can be some of the strongest and most intensely observed on Earth. And they're also very easily recognized on satellite imagery. This image is from our Golden Case, our most intense cold air outbreak that we observed during the field campaign. And you see a lot of these clouds flowing in from the northwest over the Greenland ice sheet down to the southeast, where you see a lot of these clouds flowing in these street-like patterns that are roughly aligned with the wind. So now getting into the CEASAR field campaign. CEASAR stands for the Cold Air Outbreak Experiment in the Subarctic region. Big, long acronym, as I'm sure most of you are aware of. A lot of these field campaigns have. It was conducted from February 22nd to April 7th of last year. So about this time last year. It's based in Kiruna, Sweden, which is the northernmost city in Sweden. We used the NSF NCAR C-130 aircraft, and there were about 90 participants from a wide breadth of universities across the world that all got to contribute to the field campaign's success. And these are some pictures that I took myself while out in the field. The project had a few main goals that I briefly summarized here, one of which is to examine the structure of and atmospheric processes of these marine boundary layer clouds during cold air outbreaks and their morphological transitions. We also wanted to examine the impact of varying aerosol conditions in the upstream Arctic boundary layer. And finally, also, we had an opportunity to sample the evolution and genesis of a cold air outbreak into the genesis of a polar low. These Arctic cold air outbreaks, during these cold air outbreaks, there are a lot of different clouds that we see with satellite imagery and get to measure with the aircraft. So in this image here, these black arrows that you see, those are the rough wind directions that you see, and that red dot on there, that's where Kiruna, Sweden is. And as I previously mentioned, marine cold air outbreaks over the Norwegian Sea are typically characterized by cold and dry Arctic air that's transported southward off of the coast of Greenland. The ice-free surface releases large amounts of heat and moisture to the much colder air. And then clouds then develop at the top of the convective boundary layer and then arrange themselves in these street-like patterns here in these red highlighted regions. These streets usually end up breaking up into more open cellular structures that you see in these blue regions on the map at larger distances from the sea ice edge. Some other cloud types that we normally experience in these Arctic cold air outbreaks are some closed cells and stratocumulus clouds, some transverse bands with flow roughly perpendicular to the mean flow, some mesocyclones and polar lows, and then also some orographically enhanced clouds near the coast of Scandinavia, for example. So now that we kind of know what to expect as far as the cloud types that we're seeing in these Arctic regions over the Norwegian Sea, we then need to use the aircraft to actually sample these clouds. And so this is a typical out to the ice and back flight pattern that we have for the field campaign. Our base flight plan would begin in Kiruna, Sweden, at the Kiruna airport, and then have us flying out towards Greenland over the sea ice edge at a fairly high altitude. On the way out, we would look at the clouds using our onboard remote sensors, radars and LiDARs, and we'd also drop a curtain of drop sondes on the way out to track how the thermodynamics of the boundary layer evolved as we went further to the north. Once hopefully making it to the sea ice, we'd perform a spiral descent over the ice, and you can see that in the black line on the far right, over the sea ice. And then on our way back to Kiruna, we'd record boundary layer measurements of the aerosols above and below the clouds through constant altitude lags. And then to get information on the vertical profiles of these clouds, we would perform various vertical profile maneuvers such as ramp descents or descents, porpoising maneuvers, and sawtooth legs. So you'll hear those names mentioned a little bit later as well. And we also did get to target an opportunity to sample a polar low, as I mentioned. This is, I believe, one of the first, if not the first, field campaign where we got to fly through the genesis stage of a polar low during these Arctic CAOs. To give you a little more geographic sense of where our field campaign was conducted, that red box at the northernmost area of this map, that was our domain of the field campaign, and that little itty bitty blue, the cyan color there, that's where Kiruna, Sweden is. So that lower southeastern region of the domain. And so we would fly out over the Norwegian Sea up to the north and west to fly through these colder outbreak clouds. During the field campaign, we flew 8 research flights for a total of about 54 flight hours, and we dropped a total of 114 drop sondes throughout all 8 of these flights total. We flew 3 full fetch flights, which extended all the way out to the ice sheet, and then we had 1 polar low flight, 1 quasi-Lagrangian flight, where we got to kind of sample and categorize how the flow is changing how we're moving with the flow, and also 2 local CAO cases, and then we had 1 dust and aerosol focused flight as well. On the NSF NCAR C-130, there is a wide variety of instrumentation that can be installed onto the aircraft, and that can change based on the project goals of whichever field campaign is being flown. For our field campaign, we had about, on the order of about 30 different instruments on the aircraft. A mixture could be underneath the wings or attached to the fuselage itself, where we're having the most or the least disturbed flow from the aircraft. And on this, I'm going to show some of the main instruments that I will be using for my research. So I'm going to be focusing on using some of the cloud probe instrumentation that we had on board the aircraft. And this is showing basically size range of all of the main probes that I'll be using in the research. So the cloud droplet probe is going to, that's the CDP acronym on that blue bar at the top, which measures about particle sizes of about 2 to 50 microns or micrometers. And that is the image on the top left of the slide there. Some of the other main probes that I'll be using in my analysis is the fast 2-dimensional stereo probe, which measures particles from about 10 to 1280 microns, and then also the high volume precipitation sampler, the HVPS, is the acronym, which measures larger particles about 150 microns to about 19.2 millimeters. And those 2 optical array probes are the lower left image over there. We had a multitude of other instrumentation on board. We had a lot more high resolution imaging probes, such as the Phipps Halo and the holodeck, and then also some bulk water probes, such as the Nevzarov and the King liquid water content probe. We also had a wide variety of different aerosol probes for measuring IMPs and CCNs. And then also we had a W-band and Ka-band radar, as well as some LiDARs as well. So we had a wide variety of instrumentation, but I will be focusing on the CDP probe, and then also the main optical array probes, the FAST2DS and the HVPS. Now, a lot of you in here might not be familiar with what an optical array probe is. So I want to quickly tell you guys what that is. And so they are airborne instruments that capture shadow graph images or 2D pictures of shadows through the images of the cloud particles. And so in this image from Nollenberg et al. 1970 on the right, this is a diagram that has been flown all around our cloud physics field of how these optical array probes work. And so there's a laser beam that is projected across a photodiode array, which in this image here, that photodiode array, it's those little dots that are going across that circle at the bottom there. And it's a linear diode array. And when a particle passes through the beam, it blocks the light, and that results in a shadow of pixels. And the shadow is recorded as the diode's on and off state, and those are what is recorded. And then we can use those recorded on and off states to reconstruct a 2D binary image of these shadows as a function of time. And so what that might look like is, sorry for the low resolution of this image here, but as we reconstruct these images as a function of time, you kind of get a particle image that looks something like this. And these probes often give us really good measurements of size, shape, and orientation of all the particles that we're measuring. So that's touching on the optical array probes, but what about the CDP, the cloud droplet probe? So I said that we used 2 on the field campaign. So one of the things I needed to do was pick out which one I wanted to use, or should I take an average? Which one should I use for my analysis here? And so this is one common method that is used to determine which one is performing better per se. And so what we see here on the y-axis, that is the CDP liquid water content of the 2 CDP probes, and those are going to be referred to as LWI and LWO. And what that means is the I is the inboard probe, which is closer to the fuselage, and the outboard is further from the fuselage. And then also the King liquid water content is what we're comparing it to on the x-axis here. And really what we can gather from this is that both CDPs were well calibrated and did agree with each other. I want to remind you, this is just an image that I've used for one of the flights, research flight 5. I've gone through this for each of our 8 research flights and was able to compare them. Throughout all of them, there's a slight overestimation of the CDP liquid water contents compared to the King probe, but I did end up selecting the inboard, the more closer to the fuselage cloud droplet probe for the rest of the analysis, just because it performed ever so slightly better compared to the further out probe. So now that we know what probes we'll be using for the analysis, we need to better define what is truly in cloud, since my research is looking at in cloud times and the variability of those clouds. There's a wide variety of work and literature out there that has a wide range of different thresholds and things that they use to define what is truly in cloud. What we have decided to do is use a couple of thresholds here, and I'll explain this on the plot in a second. So in this figure up here, this is for research flight 6. It's a time series of altitude. And on top of that, these lime green segments, these are the vertical profile maneuvers that I mentioned previously. So there's ramp ascents and descents, there's porpoising and spiral maneuvers, for example. The threshold we use to define in cloud is going to be using the liquid water content of the CDP greater than 0.01 gram per cubic meter. And that's going to be most sensitive to liquid cloud. That's not really going to give us a whole lot of information about other phases of cloud, such as mixed or ice, for example. So we need to use another threshold to try and make sure we capture all of the other phases of cloud as well. And so one way we do that is by using the number concentration of the FAST2DS probe greater than 1 per liter. And so those are those red dots on there. You see the CDP liquid water content, those blue dots don't really exist, and that's because I've highlighted over them in these orange dots. So those orange dots signify the in-cloud periods that I'll be using for the analysis. And so since the CDP is very sensitive to those liquid cloud times, those are the cloud layers that we'll be using for the main analysis. And the 11 on there, for research flight 6, for example, these circled times that you see on here, these are the cloud layers that I have manually identified based on these thresholds. So you see on the later part of the flight, we flew through a lot of single layer clouds, whereas on the beginning part of the flight between 7 and 8 UTC, we did fly through some multi-layer clouds during the cold air outbreak. And now, since we've been able to kind of manually go in and determine how many cloud layers we're going through, we want to get a little more synoptic level view of the entire field campaign. We want to kind of summarize how many of these cloud layers did we go throughout the entire campaign. So I'll just quickly go through this. The blue segments are the vertical profile counts. That's just any of the vertical profiles we flew throughout the campaign. However, not all vertical profiles were flown through cloud. So that's where these orange bars come in. However, the green and red bars there, these are the ones I'm actually using in my analysis. The green bars signify the number of vertical profiles that we are using in the analysis. However, like as I previously mentioned on the last slide, we did have a few vertical profiles where we flew through multi-layer clouds. So we actually will be using 65 analyzed cloud layers throughout the rest of the research. And now that we kind of have an idea of how many different cloud layers we'll be using, we want to try and figure out what is going on inside of these clouds. What kind of properties can we measure? What kind of clouds are we going through? What phase, for example? And so one way to do this is there's an undergraduate research student in our research group, Jonathan Douglas, here at OU. He has developed a phase identification algorithm that uses a bunch of these cloud properties measured and derived from some of the main cloud probes I'll be using. So I'm not really going to go into full depth of this here, but basically we estimate the phase at each 1 second sample resolution, temporal resolution. And we use derived parameters from the CDP, the FAST2DS, HVPS, and then also the King liquid water content probe, and then the voltage change of the Rosemount Icing detector, which is really sensitive to supercooled liquid droplets. And the main take-home message from the phase ID algorithm is that if the number concentration of the CDP is greater than or equal to 10 per cubic centimeter, there's a strong signal for small liquid drops. On the other hand, if the number concentration of the HVPS, so measuring those larger particles greater than 1,000 microns, if that's greater than or equal to 1,000 per meter, there's a strong signal for large ice. So how often did we fly through the different phases? So now we can go back into another distribution plot here. This is a stacked bar plot of the number of seconds that we were flying through each phase for each flight here. And so you see it increase with as we get on through the field campaign. A lot of that is attributed to us getting a little bit more confidence in our aircraft throughout the field campaign. However, I'll hone in on research flight 7, for example, that tallest bar on the right, where these percentages signify the amount or the percentage of that phase that we flew through for all the vertical profiles. So for research flight 7, for example, for about 70% of the vertical profiles time, we flew through ice phase clouds. And in that same profile, we have about 13.3% mixed phase, for example. So this kind of gives us an idea of the distribution of these cloud phases that we flew throughout the campaign. But we also want to figure out where in cloud did these phases occur. And so that leads us to our next altitude time series here. So I picked that same research flight 6 to look into here. Those orange bars in the background, those orange bars in the background, those are those vertical profile maneuvers I've previously defined. And now over top of that, we have the output of the phase algorithm, the ice, mixed, liquid, or drizzle phase. And so one thing we see here that's actually pretty common that some previous literature has shown in these Arctic clouds is that we have a lot of liquid-topped and drizzle-topped clouds where we have a mixture of mixed phase and ice phase going throughout the cloud and then even falling below the cloud as well. And like I said, this has been a common occurrence in some of these Arctic field campaigns. But we want to figure out what controls these cloud properties. So we would need to go ahead and start looking into some vertical profiles. So this here is one way that I've made a quick look of going into each individual vertical profile. So just a quick summary of this here. The 4 plots show the FAST2DS number concentration at various size ranges on the left, the CDP liquid water content, the estimated cloud phase from the output from the algorithm, and then the measured temperature and dew point on the far right from the aircraft itself. The magenta regions, those pink regions, are the in-cloud defined regions, again, from the CDP liquid water content greater than 0.01 gram per cubic meter, so mainly the liquid cloud region. And then also below that, we have a lot of precipitating ice as those yellow regions you see below cloud. So this is an example of what a liquid or a multi-layer cloud would look like. But then we also had a lot of single layer clouds as well. And so one way we can go into the phase identification algorithm and kind of verify whether the algorithm is outputting what we would expect or what we want it to be outputting is by looking at some of the imagery that is produced from these optical array probes that I briefed about earlier. So picking out one of the times of this precipitating ice below the cloud. So the way these images work, there are these strips of these images. And so each strip is about 1/3 of a second. using this processing data or this processing code. And you see a lot of these ice particles and aggregates and snowflakes throughout these images here. But we can also look at the mixed phase clouds, where we get a lot of, there's some dendrites, some ice crystals, as well as some liquid particles there. Or then for the liquid, we can verify a lot of these particles look spherical in their nature. And then for the drizzle, it's basically larger sized liquids. So they're also going to look spherical as well. There's still some further verification I'd look to be doing in the future, going a little more nitty-gritty into it and looking at every single time instead of just spot checking, and also possibly looking at some of the higher resolution images as well from some of the other probes. But this is what we've got so far. And when Jonathan produced this for the impacts field campaign previously, he had an estimation of about 95.7% accurate with this algorithm. So we're doing pretty well with it. All right, so now we're going to get into another part of the analysis where we're going to start looking at these individual cloud layers. So like I said, there's 65 total cloud layers throughout the 58 vertical profiles throughout the field campaign. The x-axis here are some of the, I just selected a few of the cloud properties derived from some of the OAPs and the CDP here. And then on the y-axis, we have decided to normalize the altitude here. And so what that really means is we've just set 0 as the cloud base and 1 as the cloud top. This is really good to do because the cloud thicknesses were ranging from a wide variety of ranges from about 150 meters in cloud thickness to about 2,000 meters. So this kind of standardized the altitude here. And what you see here, all these blue dots, these are the 1-second observations from all these instruments. And then also their line of best fit and their standard deviations as well. And so basically, there's a whole lot of variability you probably see here. All these blue scatter plot dots, they're scattered everywhere. You can see a rough relationship of all of these variables increasing with height, but there's a ton of variability. So we want to, one of our main goals now is to try and categorize what is truly causing this variability. And so this is going to be the main driver of the rest of the research that I'll be doing, that I'll show in the next few slides and also from here on out. And that is going to be looking at and trying to categorize how these vertical profiles vary with various environmental conditions. So I'll go ahead and brief you guys on what these plots will look like, since you'll see a lot of these in the next few slides. On the x-axis, we have the cloud property that will be plotted here. And you see that blue highlighted box on the top as well. These purple boxes show the environmental condition that I'll currently be analyzing, as well as in the legend, those are the environmental condition categories that I've decided on binning them into. And then on the y-axis, we have the normalized altitude, where again, the cloud base is 0 and the cloud top is 1. And then that equation on the right is how we actually calculate the normalized altitude. And so basically, these plots, I take all of the 65 cloud layers, I take the vertical profiles of those cloud layers, and I assign them into an environmental condition bin based on those environmental conditions. So for the temperature at cloud-based, the cloud-based temperature that we're currently looking at, I would take, say we have a cloud layer that is stretching from, we start hitting it at 11 UTC and end at like 1105 UTC. And we can take basically there's two ways we can do this thus far, depending on the environmental condition. We can either take the average lat long throughout that entire spatial path that we take throughout that cloud, and then take the point value of the environmental condition at that spot, and then that's how we categorize that. Another way of doing it is just taking the average of the environmental condition along the path of the flight. And so that'll depend on the environmental condition that we're analyzing. And so basically, again, we categorize each of those individual cloud layers into these environmental condition categories. And so a takeaway that we can get from at least this plot for now, so again, we're looking at how the average vertical profiles of the CDP number concentration for varying cloud-based temperatures, the environmental condition of cloud-based temperature between -10 and -20 degrees Celsius is greater than the warmer and the cooler cloud-based temperature ranges, or at least for as far as CDP number concentration goes. However, there's not really any clear monotonic trend or variation in how the CDP number concentrations vary with cloud-based temperature. It'd be a lot easier to tell, if we had, maybe say we had warmer environmental conditions where we had these greater number concentrations going in order to the colder cloud-based temperatures. But we don't really have that. So that tells us maybe we should start looking at some other cloud properties. So we're going to continue looking at the cloud-based temperature here. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but basically there's a few of the CDP. Some of the CDP variables are on the left column, the fast 2DS in the middle, and then the HVPS on the right. And just some of the key takeaways here, I'm not going to go through each one, but we have warmer cloud-based, for warmer cloud bases. So again, this is all of the vertical profiles, the average vertical profile of all of them within that warmer cloud base temperature category. We're seeing higher liquid water contents measured from the CDP. So maybe there's perhaps some more condensational growth with retaining more liquid water a lot. There's a lot to try and figure out when we see these distributions. On the contrary, for these colder cloud-based temperatures, we're seeing higher total water contents from the fast 2DS and the HVPS near the cloud base. You see that spike towards the bottom of those two bottom plots down there. And the opposite is true towards the top part of the cloud. But then also for these colder cloud-based temperatures, we have higher number concentrations of the HVPS. So maybe there's possible ice phase growth via some rhyming and aggregation leading to these larger particles in these colder cloud-based regimes. So these are the kinds of relationships that we're going to try and find using these average vertical profile plots. But now that we're starting to get a sense of how these may vary, how these cloud properties may vary with an environmental conditions such as cloud-based temperature, maybe there's a relationship that we can find in another environmental condition. So the next one we'll take a look at is going to be called estimated inversion strength. And what that is, it's a proxy for atmospheric stability. Using this equation from Wood and Brotherton 2006, I basically calculated the EIS using the lower tropospheric stability, which is the difference in the potential temperature between 700 hectopascals and the surface. Subtracted the moist adiabatic lapse rate at 850, and then multiplied that by the scale height at 700 minus the LCL. And I basically calculated that for each grid point across the entire domain, and then I have a field of EIS that I can take a look at. And based on that field, I can categorize each of the vertical profiles on the EIS category. And so I've defined the categories. These warmer colors here, let me get rid of this here. These warmer colors here are going to represent higher stability regimes, so greater than or equal to 15 degrees Kelvin, and the blue or the cooler colors, as we get more cool in the colors, they are the lower stability regimes, so greater instability. So the key takeaway we can get from these types of plots is that we're seeing that for higher stability regimes, high EIS, we're seeing higher number concentration of the CDP and lower effective diameters of the CDP. This may mean that ice particles may not be able to grow as fast as in the high stability regimes. But also in these higher stability regimes, we see smaller droplets, and that's you can see in the CDP effective diameter, that top middle plot. We're seeing these smaller droplets due to possible reduced droplet growth in these more stable regimes. But we're seeing larger droplets with the lower stability regimes, these cooler colors. As expected from enhanced coalescence from the stronger updrafts that we might usually see with these greater instability regimes. Another thing we can take a look at is we're seeing lower stability regimes having higher effective diameters from the fast 2DS. When we're having these up in these more unstable regimes, we're having a lot of this overturning as we're having a strong updraft going through these clouds, and that's causing a lot of turbulence and mixing and a lot of collision going on within the cloud. And that may also lead to droplet growth, whereas for the higher stability regimes, there's a lot less of this going on, possibly showing that these smaller droplets and suggesting less turbulence and precipitation formation. Looking at some of the larger particles, so the HVPS, again, this is going to really image a lot of the larger precipitation sized particles, ice, things like that. Seeing for low stability regimes, there's a higher number concentration of the HVPS and total water content of the HVPS as well. So these high stability regimes suppress precipitation, as I previously mentioned, development, while the lower stability regimes promotes these deeper clouds, again, stronger updrafts and more droplet growth. So basically the take-home message from looking at estimated inversion strength is that in these higher stability regimes, you're a lot less likely to have the precipitation falling in these clouds. Whereas for the lower stability regimes, there's a higher concentration of these precipitation-sized drops. And they're also, you see these bimodal peaks on these lower few plots with the lower stability regimes in the blue, possibly pointing to some of the particles that are growing up towards the top of the cloud and then also falling out towards the bottom. But so we can go ahead and take a look at another environmental condition. So this one here is going to be the sea surface temperatures, and this is measured from the University of Bremen in Germany, the AMSR Advanced Microwave Sensing Radiometer. Measured SSTs, the sea surface temperatures. And so just quickly going for this, you might see there really isn't a clear trend that we're seeing with how these average vertical profiles are varying with sea surface temperatures. So this really opens the floor, keeps the door open to looking at further environmental conditions as the research continues and progresses after today, for sure. So I guess with that being said, I'll go ahead and go into my conclusion and summary. So we know the phase identification algorithm that we implemented has been working pretty well. I do intend on going on a little bit more in depth to really investigate if it's catching all, it's not just being a catch-all, and it's really catching all of the possible cases there could be with these phase ID estimations. We did sample all phases of cloud with lots of variability measured, as we saw in the first few normalized altitude plots that I showed. That needs to be further investigated as a function of environmental condition, which I've just been showing. Some of the environmental conditions I showed were sea surface temperature, cloud-based temperature, and then EIS, the atmospheric stability. And we found that it does indeed shape in-cloud microphysical structure. Future work will examine dependence on other environmental conditions, such as cloud type, surface fluxes, wind shear, aerosol concentrations, et cetera, and look at the dependence of phase-specific cloud properties on these conditions. And we'll also look at times that are below cloud. Since when we have normalized altitude of 0 to 1, we're always looking at that in cloud time. So we want to see if there's any relationship we can see happening below the cloud as well. It's easy to look at some of these environmental condition plots and see, hey, we're seeing a lot higher number concentrations in these warmer regimes, for example. But it's a lot harder to try and figure out what's going on in the background, what's controlling why we're seeing this, and maybe try and figure out what kind of relationship this shows us about some of the processes that are occurring in the cloud. Because we can't measure the processes. You can measure the properties, though. So I guess I'll leave it at that and open the floor up to any questions. And I had to plug a few of the cool pictures I took during the field campaign. The far right is us and Greg out there on the shift, and the top is we had every day we do a weather briefing. So I was grateful to be part of that team, and then had to put some Northern Lights pictures in there. So I guess that's it. Let me know if you guys have any questions.
I'd like to open the floor for questions for our speaker. So I noticed it was slide 20. You switched from absolute altitude to normalized altitude. You might have mentioned this, but why did you make that change?
Oh yeah. Okay. So I might have mentioned this, but I'll go into it again one more time. So the reason we do this, so a lot of these cloud thicknesses that we flew through throughout the campaign, there was a wide range. I think it was about 150 meters to more convective clouds that we sampled during the polar low case, the polar low flight that we flew, where those reached about cloud thicknesses of about 2,000 meters. So a lot taller clouds compared to these lower stratocumulus clouds during the colder outbreaks. And so the reason we normalize the altitude is we get a better sense of, we can actually, I don't want to say normalize the altitude, it's in the name, but it gives us a better sense of, we can get a better relationship of what's going on, say, in the upper 25% of the cloud or the lower 50% of the cloud, for example. And again, it really gives us a better sense of where different things are going on and different things are being measured inside these clouds relative, with taking out the variation in cloud thicknesses that we had through the campaign. So I hope that answers your question.
Can I ask a question that's not strictly a science question?
Sure.
Well, how turbulent was it flying through these clouds?
Oh, it was a fun time. So I was fortunate to go on 2 of the flights during the campaign. So very fortunate. Thank you, Greg, for that. So on one of the flights, I guess I'll give a quick synopsis of what I did on these flights. The first flight, it was called assistant mission scientist. And basically I was more or less a note taker for the entire flight. And also got to take a lot of pictures and videos. And I think you saw in one of the previous slides, you're actually able to go into the cockpit during these flights. Whereas, when you're in these commercial flights in the US, the FAA is very regulatory on these, and you obviously can't do that for a lot of security reasons. But on the other flight I got to be on, I got to actually operate, it's called the GVR. It's upward facing radiometer. And so on that aircraft, on that flight, I was in the back of the plane. And so when you're flying just in general, it wasn't very turbulent, but when you're going through these clouds, for example, it did get pretty turbulent. And in that picture of the aircraft you see there, you might notice there's not a lot of windows. So if you get, motion sickness or anything, it might not be the most fun experience. I didn't get to go onto the polar low flight. I was actually back in Norman by then. But those convective clouds, I know they had a lot of differences in wind shear and vertical velocities and things. And I heard it wasn't the most fun to fly through, but it wasn't too bad at least for me, I guess.
It didn't save you from my question.
Oh gosh.
Do you expect there to be any dependence on the thickness of the cloud and the estimated inversion strength or the stability? And if so, do you think any of the trends you're seeing are perhaps due to the fact that your depth scale has changed? And if you had plotted directly, say, as a function of height above cloud base, you would not have seen such strong relationships?
Perhaps I could see that. I had a feeling you would ask something like this. As far as the cloud thickness, that is actually one of the environmental conditions. Like I'll make plots similar to what you're seeing here, for example. I have it as cloud thickness is one as well. I haven't gotten to actually dive into it to see if there's any variability in these average vertical profiles with cloud thickness, but perhaps there could be. I don't have an honest answer as to what exactly I would expect, at least at this point in time. But I have seen a lot of previous literature that instead of normalizing altitude, they would look at altitude above cloud base or something like that as well. So I could look into it a little bit more. I can't give an exact answer on the relationship I would expect at this point.
I'll ask another question. Do you think you have enough? How much data do you need to look at these type of relations? Do you think you have good enough statistical database to examine these relationships? How much data do you need?
I'm not fully sure. I haven't done any statistical tests like a t-test or anything like that. That is something on my plan to-do list that I do want to do, as well as like a sensitivity test for some of the categories that I've chosen for some of the environmental conditions, as well as what we define as in cloud. That doesn't fully answer your question, but
I want to think about them before your defense.
yeah, for sure.
Well, if there are no further questions, I'll save you from anymore. And thank you for your talk.
Awesome.